Monasteries along the northern coasts once believed stone walls and sacred vows could protect them from the outside world. Yet in the late 700 seconds, when the longships pushed through morning fog and scraped upon their shores, the world of the Christian cloisters collided with the raw certainty of the Viking Age. The raiders came not only for silver, cattle, or relics, but because monasteries stood alone, unwalled, and filled with people who did not resist. To the Norse, they were places where the weak stored their wealth. To the monks and nuns inside, they were sanctuaries suddenly exposed to a violent era that did not understand sanctity. This story blends what historians know with a narrative formed from countless similar tragedies. It follows one such community, an isolated convent off the coast of Northumbria, whose quiet prayers were broken by oars, smoke, and the thunder of voices speaking a language none of them knew. What happened after the raid was not always death. Often, it was a dismantling of identity, a stripping away of stability, and a journey into a world where ransom, bondage, and cultural erasure became the new reality. Their survival depended not on faith alone, but on understanding the people who had torn their world apart. Long before the raiders were seen, the coast sensed them. The fishermen who lived in small huts along the Northumbrian shore spoke of strange wakes in the water-thin cuts across the tide that did not match any local craft. They noticed seabirds lifting suddenly and flying inland as if pushed by an invisible wall of wind. But at the convent of St. Elwyn, these signs meant little. The nuns lived by bells, not by tides, and the rhythms of the sea belonged to others. Their days unfolded with predictable calm. Dawn prayers, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, preparing meals for the poor who sometimes wandered to their gates. The world outside moved as it always had, and they believed it would remain so. Sister Runa Young, recently initiated and more attentive to worldly sounds than she should have been, felt unease before anyone else. It came not from fear, but from a subtle change in the coastal air. The wind shifted too quickly. The gulls quieted too long. It was as though something beyond the horizon pressed forward with intent. When she mentioned it to Mother Brynhild, the abbess only offered a gentle correction. The Lord sends signs for reflection, not worry. But Runa sensed the sign was not divine. Far across the water, beyond what any of them could see from the convent's narrow cliffs, a fleet of longships was cutting toward the shore. Their hulls, shaped for shallow coasts, moved quickly in the morning stillness. The Vikings aboard did not shout or sing. Silence was their shield during these first moments, when surprise was worth more than steel. They were men accustomed to reading landscapes. With accuracy, coastlines marked potential wealth. Unprotected churches meant easy plunder. Isolated communities offered captives who could be traded or ransomed. At the convent, the morning bell rang as usual. The sisters gathered for prayer, unaware of how vulnerable their routines made them. The walls around them were thin, built for contemplation rather than defense. Their wooden gate had no iron reinforcement. Even their storehouse, filled with grain and modest supplies, sat exposed. They had always trusted that distance and devotion protected them. No armed garrison lived nearby. No warning system existed for sudden seaborne threats. The quiet of the prayer hall broke when Brother Osric, a traveling scribe who had come to deliver parchment, burst through the entrance. His face was pale, and his breath came in sharp fragments. "Ships," he managed to say. "Dragon-headed ships on the water. Dozens." His voice trembled not from exertion, but from recognition. Stories of Lindisfarne, raided years earlier, had spread across every monastery in the land. The descriptions matched perfectly. Curved prows, shallow keels, crimson-painted shields hanging along the rails. Panic did not immediately follow. Many of the sisters stared in stunned silence, their minds slow to grasp the reality. Some clutched crosses at their necks. Others murmured short prayers, hoping the ships might pass by. But Runa's body moved before her thoughts did. She ran to the cliffside path, ignoring the abbess's call to stay inside. And there she saw them, ships aligned like teeth across the horizon, cutting closer with every heartbeat. Their sails billowed with an unnatural confidence. These were not traders seeking harbor. They were raiders approaching prey. Mother Brynhild sounded the warning bell, though she knew it was futile. The convent had no soldiers, no walls, and no time. The sisters scattered some to hide manuscripts, some to gather sacred vessels, others to bar the wooden gate even though it could not hold. Runa remained at the cliff until the first ships reached the shoals, their oars lifting in synchronized arcs. She could hear their shields clatter. She could see faces now stern, windburned, focused. These were not men seeking chaos. They were men executing a practiced craft. When Runa finally ran back toward the hall, the ground beneath her feet felt unsteady. The abbess was organizing the sisters into the center of the courtyard, urging calm. "The Lord will protect us," she said, yet her voice, usually steady, wavered at the edges. Even she understood the limits of faith when confronted with steel. The first Vikings reached the gate with astonishing speed. Their axes bit into the wood, splintering it within moments. A second team pushed forward, forcing the weakened barrier inward until it cracked and fell. They poured into the courtyard with efficiency, shouting commands in Old Norse, spreading out in lines, seizing control with movements that had been repeated in countless raids before. They struck no one at first. It was not death they sought, but dominance. The sisters huddled together, gripping each other's sleeves. The abbess stepped forward, raising one hand as though her gesture could halt the storm. The leader of the raiders, a tall man with a fur-lined cloak and braids woven through his beard, studied her briefly. He understood enough Latin to recognize religious authority, but this offered no immunity. Monasteries had long been known to store silver liturgical objects, coins, and portable treasures. To the Norse, a nun's vow of poverty did not imply her house held nothing of value. The leader signaled to his men. They fanned out, securing doorways, blocking exits, and herding the sisters toward the center. The reality settled with crushing clarity. This was not simply a raid. It was an act of removal, of uprooting a community, and determining which members were worth ransoming, which would be taken to Norse settlements, and which might never return. Runa felt her breath catch as the leader approached the group. His eyes, sharp and assessing, swept across the faces before him. She realized then that their ordeal had only begun. Survival would depend on more than prayer. It would require understanding the intentions of the men who had crossed the sea, and learning how to live in a world shaped not by bells and scripture, but by force, calculation, and the cold logic of raiding culture. The courtyard settled into a tense stillness, broken only by the creaking of shattered gate planks and the murmured prayers of the sisters. The raiders moved with an order that felt almost ritualistic, men spreading through the convent, not as a chaotic mob, but as a trained company following patterns they had rehearsed countless times along distant coasts. They searched with the discipline of those who understood that every breath spent here needed purpose. The longer a raid lasted, the greater the danger of local retaliation. Mother Brynhild stood at the front of the cluster of nuns, her back straight, her hands clasped at her waist. She did not tremble, though her face had lost all color. The leader of the Norsemen stepped toward her again. Behind him, two younger raiders carried a wooden tally board, a practice common in their homeland. They used marks to keep track of valuables, livestock, and captives. To them, this was no sacred ground. It was an inventory site. He spoke first, not a shout, but a firm sentence in a language most of the sisters did not understand. Yet the meaning became clear when he gestured at them with an open hand, and then pointed to the tally board. It was a demand for names, the beginning of sorting, the start of ownership as the Vikings understood it. To record a name was to claim it. Mother Brynhild answered in Latin, the only common tongue she could hope they recognized. "We are servants of God," she said. "This is a holy house. There is nothing here for you." The leader studied her. He had heard similar protests in other lands. The monks and nuns always said their homes were poor, yet his men consistently found chalices of silver, ornate illuminated books worth ransoms, carved reliquaries, and tools forged from quality iron. Holy houses were wealthy by virtue of devotion, and he learned long ago that piety and possessions rarely separated cleanly. He spoke again, shorter this time, and raised two fingers. Immediately, a pair of raiders stepped into the hall adjacent to the courtyard. Their boots echoed as they searched through storerooms, kitchens, and scriptoriums. The crashes that followed, splintered shelves, overturned benches, clattering pots sent fresh waves of fear through the sisters. Runa felt her breath tightening. She had seen storms batter the coast before, but nothing like this quiet, intentional dismantling of their sanctuary. The leader tapped the tally board with his knuckle. He waited. Mother Brynhild realized he would not be denied. Slowly, with a steadying breath, she began to speak the names of her convent, beginning with the eldest sisters, ending with the novices. The raiders marked each name with strokes carved into wood. Runa watched the board fill with those strokes, and the sight chilled her. It was not merely a list. It was a transfer, the first step of their passage into another world. When her turn came, she hesitated only a heartbeat before saying her name aloud. The raider writing the marks glanced at her briefly, as though weighing something. She wondered what an outsider saw when looking at her: fear, defiance, or simply youth. Whatever judgment he made, his face revealed nothing. He carved her name into the board like all the others. Once the tally was complete, the Vikings began separating the sisters into groups. They sorted them not by age or rank, but by physical condition: those able to walk long distances, those appearing strong enough for work or potential ransom, and those they considered too frail to transport far. The abbess tried to intervene, stepping forward to shield the older nuns, but a raider gently but firmly pulled her aside. Their intent was not senseless violence, it was classification. Runa ended up in the middle group, surrounded by sisters who stood stiffly, their faces pale but composed. The youngest novice, Sister Elswith, clung to her arm, whispering small fragments of psalms. Runa squeezed her hand to reassure her, though she herself felt hollow. The Vikings divided with precision, creating lines as though preparing a procession. This was not a slaughter. It was the organized dismantling of a community. A sudden noise broke through the courtyard, the clatter of metal against stone. A raider emerged carrying the convent's silver chalice, lifting it for the leader to see. The leader nodded once. Another mark was made on the tally board. Behind him, more raiders appeared holding manuscripts, sealed jars, cut lengths of cloth, and tools. Each item was logged and carried toward the ships. They worked with a speed that came from years of honing their methods. For the sisters, the hurt was not only fear, but disorientation. Everything they knew was being treated as material, stripped of its sacred meaning. The illuminated manuscripts they had copied for months were bound like cargo. The chalice blessed for Mass was now an object to melt or trade. Their world was being rewritten through unfamiliar hands. When the raiders finished their collection, the leader gave a short command. The groups of captives were guided toward the broken gate and down to the shore. The abbess walked at the front, chin high, refusing to show despair. Runa admired her strength, but she could not pretend to feel it. A future she could not imagine was pulling her forward. As they crossed the threshold of the convent, the place they once believed protected them from earthly harm, Runa looked back. Sunlight filtered across the courtyard, illuminating the scattered pages, broken pots, and footprints carved into the dust. The place of prayer had become a place of departure. The Vikings did not look back. They had taken names. They had taken objects. Now they would take the people who carried both memory and value. For the sisters, the world ahead was a horizon as cold as the sea that carried their captors. They did not yet know where they were being taken, only that the first chapter of their lives had ended at the sound of axes against wood. The path from the convent to the shore was not long, yet it felt stretched by dread, as though each step pulled the sisters farther from the world they had known. The Vikings herded them in a loose but controlled formation, their movements efficient but not cruel. They did not shove or strike unless someone resisted, and even then, the correction was swift rather than spiteful. Their discipline made the scene feel colder. Rage would have been easier to understand than this calm, deliberate capture. The coastline below was a long crescent of wet sand, bordered by jagged rocks that jutted like teeth from the earth. The tide had pulled back, leaving reflective pools that mirrored the sky. 3 longships rested in the shallows, their carved prows towering like beasts from forgotten myths. A thin mist hovered above the water, catching the morning light and giving the scene an almost unnatural brightness. Against that brightness, the sisters appeared ghost-like, their habits soaked at the hems and billowing slightly with each breeze. Runa kept close to Elswith, who trembled with each cry that echoed across the shoreline. Those cries came from villagers, fishermen, and their families who had also been taken. Most were bound at the wrists, some already sitting in small groups beside the ships, staring blankly at the sand. The Vikings preferred to fill their ships efficiently, mixing captives from different villages so no group retained a sense of unity. Fragmentation weakened resistance. Sister Aelith, one of the older nuns, whispered, "They came for the coast, not only for us." She was right. The raiders had descended upon an entire stretch of settlements, striking them within minutes of each other. This was coordinated, not opportunistic. On the beach, the leader barked another command, short, rough, and final. The Vikings began separating the sisters once more, but this time with more nuance. Some of the raiders possessed experience in dealing with Christian communities, and they observed the captives closely. Posture, speech, confidence, fear. These were indicators of potential ransom value. A noble-born nun could be traded for silver or land concessions. A scribe could fetch a price as a skilled thrall. A healer could be claimed for labor. Runa felt hands pull Elswith away from her. The novice cried out, instinctively reaching back. Runa tried to follow, but a raider stepped between them and shook his head. The signal was clear obedience, now meant survival. Runa swallowed the impulse to resist, though her stomach twisted painfully. Losing one another so quickly intensified the sense that their identities were being dismantled piece by piece. One of the longships shifted as the tide pushed forward, its hull groaning against the sand. A group of raiders secured ropes and prepared to board the first set of captives. The sisters watched as the villagers were directed onto the vessel, their movements stiff from fear. Some stumbled on the planks. None resisted. The presence of armed men and the looming sea stripped them of the will to fight. At the edge of the water, Mother Brynhild lifted her face toward the ships. She carried herself as though crossing a threshold of ceremony rather than captivity. Though her expression remained solemn, she held a strength that surprised even the Vikings. Several of the raiders glanced at her with curiosity, perhaps recognizing that leadership existed even in those they captured. The leader approached her again. He studied her intently, then spoke a phrase softened by familiarity with Latin pronunciation. "You guide them?" His accent was thick, but the question was clear. Brynhild hesitated, unsure whether answering would help or harm. Finally, she nodded. "You come first," he said. Runa saw her jaw tighten, but the abbess did not refuse. She stepped forward, and the raiders lifted her onto the ship with unexpected gentleness. Not respect, practicality. Leaders among captives were valuable. They kept others calm. As more sisters were guided toward the ships, Runa felt a sudden pressure on her shoulder. A raider, younger than most, motioned toward the far end of the vessel. His expression seemed less severe than the others, though still unreadable. She followed his gesture and stepped carefully along the plank, her sandals slipping slightly on the wet wood. The deck of the ship felt foreign under her feet, narrow, curved, alive with movement. The mast rose like a rigid spine, ropes hanging like tendons. Shields lined the railing, each painted with patterns that felt both beautiful and ominous. The air smelled of seawater, tar, and unwashed wool. Beneath the deck, she could hear muffled sounds, cargo shifting, tools knocking gently as the tide rocked the vessel. The Vikings continued loading the captives with practiced precision, arranging them to keep the ship balanced. A few raiders took positions at the rail with spears, watching the shoreline for signs of resistance. None came. The horizon remained empty, save for the smoke of small fires where huts had already been searched. Runa sat on a wooden bench, clasping her hands to steady herself. The ship felt like a border between who she had been and whoever she would now become. She scanned the deck for Elswith but could not find her. The ache of that absence settled deep within her chest. A sudden horn blast rang across the bay, sharp, deep, echoing off the cliffs. The sound froze everyone in place. Then it repeated once, twice, a signal to the entire fleet. The tide had turned. It was time to depart. Rowers took their places, long oars slipping silently into the water. The leader stood at the prow, his posture steady as he watched the shore shrink. With a final command, the oars pushed forward in unity, pulling the ship away from the land, where Runa's life had been rooted. She kept her eyes fixed on the coastline until it blurred into mist, its last features dissolving, as though the world itself were erasing her past. The sisters huddled together, some weeping quietly, others staring blankly, their minds unable to process the enormity of the moment. The raiders spoke among themselves in low tones, their words unfamiliar, yet steady. To them, this voyage was routine. To the captives, it was the beginning of a path none had imagined. Runa's thoughts drifted through fear, confusion, and an unfamiliar resolve. Though taken, she was not erased. Though carried into the unknown, she felt the faint stirrings of something she had not expected, the need to observe, to understand, to endure. The shore had been taken from her, but the story of what happened next would depend on how she faced the open sea. The longship moved with a steady rhythm. Once the oars found the open water, the Vikings worked in practiced silence, each movement calibrated through years of voyaging along the North Sea. Their coordination gave the vessel an almost mechanical quality, as though it were a single organism advancing across the waves. The captives, arranged along the central benches, felt the motion through their bodies before they understood the geography unfolding around them. They were no longer part of a monastery or coastal settlement. They were now passengers in a system designed for extraction, transport, and assimilation into networks that stretched far beyond their own experience. The sea became the dominant presence. The shoreline diminished until it blended with the sky, and the noise of the raid faded into memory. The horizon offered no markers, only the consistent sound of the oars, the creaking of wood, and the low exchanges between the raiders filled the air. The ship held its course without hesitation. Viking navigators relied on coastal outlines, stars, wind direction, and the behavior of seabirds. Even without instruments, they traveled distances that startled the monastic world, whose communities rarely ventured far beyond their own walls. The captives' fear shifted into a quieter, heavier form, an awareness of isolation. They had entered a zone where escape was impossible, and where identity depended on observation rather than resistance. Mother Brynhild kept the nuns calm by speaking in low, steady tones. Her presence served as an anchor, even though she had no more control over their fate than they did. The Vikings tolerated her attempts at reassurance because order among captives served practical needs. Disorder slowed voyages and required manpower to contain. The journey reinforced the structure of authority on the ship. The leader, identifiable by his deliberate movement and the attention he commanded, navigated not by force but by certainty. His subordinates responded to gestures rather than extended commands. Their discipline distinguished them not as uncontrolled raiders, but as part of a maritime culture shaped by communal decision-making during travel and hierarchical decisions during raids. The captives witnessed a social structure that differed sharply from the monastic order they knew. The Vikings combined flexibility with decisiveness, adapting quickly to changing conditions while maintaining dominance through routine rather than spectacle. Runa observed these patterns with growing clarity. Her fear did not lessen, but it reorganized itself into watchfulness. She studied how the raiders distributed tasks. Some handled rigging, others monitored the horizon, and others checked the bindings of certain captives. The younger raiders asked questions of the older ones, receiving brief responses meant for learning. These moments revealed that raiding voyages were not random bursts of violence, but intergenerational training exercises, passing maritime and logistical knowledge from one cohort to the next. The longship maintained a consistent speed. When the wind strengthened, the sail was unfurled, and the shift from oar power to wind power brought a collective sigh of relief from the rowers. The ship tilted slightly as it caught the breeze, gliding with reduced strain. The captives instinctively tightened their grip on whatever surface they could reach. The movement was not dangerous, but it carried unfamiliarity. Many of them had never traveled by water. The sea became another force, shaping their disorientation. Food was distributed sparingly. The Vikings ate dried fish, hard bread, and fermented drink from shared containers. Captives received reduced portions, just enough to maintain strength without consumption of valuable stores. Hydration came from barrels of water rationed carefully by those who understood the demands of long voyages. The nuns accepted the provisions silently, though their hands shook from cold and fear. The practical nature of the raiders' distribution made clear that preservation of captives was intentional. Their value depended on survival. The passage of time blurred. Without bells or familiar routines, the sisters lost the ability to ground themselves in hours. Daylight changed, winds shifted, and the sea beneath them moved from calm expanses to choppier currents. The vessel adapted to each change without hesitation. Even during more forceful waves, the ship demonstrated the engineering skill of its makers. The shallow draft allowed flexibility. The curved hull cut through water efficiently. The oars stabilized movement when wind alone could not. Toward the middle of the voyage, the Vikings altered their formation. The three ships from the raid converged, aligning side by side. They exchanged shouted updates regarding wind patterns, land sightings, and their next harbor point. This coordination reflected a larger network of coastal intelligence. The Norse maintained safe harbors in the islands, river mouths, and settled territories where they could regroup before entering broader trade or slave routes. The ships did not linger together long. Their communication was brief and direct before they resumed independent trajectories. Runa listened without understanding the language, but sensed meaning in tone and reaction. The raiders' confidence did not appear reckless. It arose from repetition of these routes and familiarity with the risks. Their knowledge of weather, geography, and ship behavior surpassed anything she had previously imagined. The journey forced her to reconsider assumptions she held about the Viking world. It was not solely defined by violence. It was defined by mobility, resilience, and a detailed understanding of northern waters. As the day stretched on, faint outlines emerged on the horizon. Low land, partially obscured by mist, appeared ahead. The raiders reacted with quiet acknowledgement rather than celebration. Their readiness suggested that this had been expected. They secured ropes, adjusted the sail, and prepared for landing procedures. The captives felt the ship shift in anticipation. A new phase of their displacement approached, one not defined by immediate violence, but by placement into systems of evaluation, trade, and labor. The approaching shoreline marked the beginning of a transition. The raid was complete. The transport was ending. The next stage would involve assessment by individuals who did not participate in the raid, but who specialized in determining the economic and social use of new captives. The sisters did not yet understand this structure, but the Vikings did. They were bringing human property into territories where value, not identity, would be the basis of all decisions. By the time the ship angled toward the coast, the captives had fallen into silence. The sea, which had carried them away from everything they knew, now delivered them into a world they had never imagined. The horizon closed behind them as steadily as it had opened, sealing the distance from the life they had left. The shoreline that came into view was neither a settlement nor a fortified town. It was a utilitarian harbor point, used not for living but for sorting, resting, and redistributing people and goods taken during raids. The land rose gently from the water, covered in coarse grass, shaped by strong winds. A few timber structures stood near the edge of the shore, built for storage and temporary shelter rather than comfort. Smoke rose from a single fire pit where a group of Norsemen awaited the incoming ships. The raiders maneuvered the longship toward a shallow stretch where the hull could partially rest on sand without risk of damage. They worked with an economy of motion. Some secured the vessel with ropes tied to posts embedded deep in the ground. Others lowered planks to guide captives onto the beach. The captives hesitated at first, unsure whether stepping onto new land brought danger or relief. Yet the Vikings maintained order without shouting, directing movement with gestures shaped by experience. As the sisters disembarked, the wind struck them with a sharp chill. The air smelled of seawater, damp earth, and smoke from the campfire. The environment felt harsh but functional. Runa observed the structures nearby: two long sheds, a small fenced enclosure, and a platform that resembled a meeting area. Nothing indicated a permanent community. This place existed for transition, not habitation. A separate group of Norsemen approached from the fire pit. men older and less heavily armed than the raiders. Their clothing showed fewer signs of recent travel. They assessed the returning crew with brief nods before turning their attention to the captives. These men were intermediaries, individuals responsible for organizing trades, determining ransom potential, and preparing captives for movement deeper into Norse-controlled territories. They operated with a detachment that differed from the intensity of the raiders. For them, evaluation was procedural. The captives were arranged in lines. The nuns found themselves adjacent to villagers from the coastline, though separated enough that no one could speak freely. Mother Brynhild remained at the front of her group. Her calm presence persisted, though her eyes held the exhaustion of the journey. The Vikings assigned one of their intermediaries to examine the group. He walked slowly down the line, stopping briefly at each person. His hands remained behind his back. He did not touch the captives, but he observed them with the precision of someone accustomed to categorization. He stopped before Sister Aelith, noting her age. She met his gaze without wavering. The man gave a slight nod and moved on. Age did not automatically reduce someone's value. Older individuals could serve in domestic labor or religious instruction in certain Norse households. Practicality mattered more than sentiment. When he reached Runa, he paused a moment longer. Her youth, posture, and alertness registered as qualities worth noting. She felt the scrutiny acutely, but remained still. The man turned slightly toward a wooden board beside him and made a brief mark. She did not know what category that mark placed her in, only that it determined her future movement. After the initial assessment, the intermediaries conferred with the raid leader. Their exchange was low and steady. No decisions were announced aloud, but outcomes soon became apparent. The captives were divided into 3 groups, based on perceived value: those suitable for ransom, those capable of skilled or domestic labor, and those destined for broader trade networks. The distinction carried no moral weight in their system. It simply reflected the economic structure surrounding raids. The nuns occupied an unusual position. Some were potential ransom candidates if the raiders could identify wealthy patrons connected to their convent. Others possessed skills that made them valuable in households' knowledge of herbal remedies, record-keeping, and religious literacy. The intermediaries lacked specific information about their origins, but the presence of religious garments implied affiliation with a well-organized Christian community. This alone elevated their potential worth. Mother Brynhild's group was assigned to an enclosure near the shore, marked by a low wooden fence. It contained straw bedding and water containers. The confinement was not harsh, but it created a physical boundary that reinforced their status. Guards remained nearby, though they did not appear anxious about escape. The coastline was unfamiliar, and the surrounding terrain offered no obvious shelter. Flight would serve only to expose captives to the elements. As the captives settled, the raiders unloaded cargo from the ships. Metalwork, woven cloth, preserved food, tools, and manuscripts were carried to the storage sheds. Items were cataloged quickly by the intermediaries. Every object had a destination, some to workshops, some to trade caravans, some to be melted down or repurposed. The Vikings treated the collected materials with efficiency rather than reverence. A silver chalice was valued for its metal content, not its sacred significance. The convent's manuscripts drew particular interest. Intermediaries examined the bindings, pigments, and script quality. Books were valued differently across regions. Some Norse households prized them for their craftsmanship, others for the novelty of the markings. The intermediaries spoke in measured tones as they selected which pieces to set aside for direct trade. Runa saw one of the raiders leaf through a manuscript with surprising care before handing it to a scribe among the Norse group. Even amid displacement, a small awareness of craftsmanship bridged cultural gaps. Meanwhile, the nuns discussed what little they understood of their situation. Mother Brynhild explained that ransoming captives was a long-standing practice in both Norse and Christian societies. The church often negotiated payments to retrieve clergy or monastic members. If word of their capture reached the right ears, they might return home. The challenge lay in communication. Their captors would not send messages voluntarily. Someone outside had to report their disappearance. This uncertainty weighed heavily. The coastline they had departed offered no immediate means for transmitting information. Without surviving witnesses or nearby settlements capable of sending envoys, The sisters' names might never be known beyond this harbor. Their community would assume death or disappearance, not captivity. Runa absorbed the reality with a quiet internal shift. Understanding the structure of their capture did not lessen its severity, but it gave shape to the void. She watched the organization of the harbor with increasing clarity. Every action followed purpose. Every movement implied a larger system behind it. This was not chaos. It was the logistics of a maritime culture operating at the edge of several worlds: trade, war, and subsistence. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped. The guards lit torches around the enclosure, casting long, wavering shadows. The nuns huddled together for warmth, their conversation reduced to brief murmurs. Runa stared past the fence at the longships resting on the shore. Their hulls reflected firelight, looking both alive and dormant. She realized that this place was only a waypoint, not a final destination. Their journey would continue once decisions were finalized. The harbor grew quiet as the raiders settled into their nightly routine. Fires burned low, the tide crept in, and the wind carried the steady pulse of northern waters. The captives lay awake, caught between exhaustion and vigilance, aware that the next day would bring further sorting and movement. The raid had uprooted them. The sea had carried them away. Now the land itself prepared to reshape them into components of a system they had never been meant to understand. Morning arrived without ceremony. A thin layer of mist clung to the shoreline, softening the outlines of the storage sheds and longships. The Vikings rose early, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of practical necessity rather than the tolling of bells. Captives learned to wake when their captors did, sensing that any delay, however small, might be interpreted as resistance. The enclosure filled with subdued rustling as the nuns straightened their garments, brushed sand from their sleeves, and offered unspoken acknowledgement of another day in captivity. The intermediaries returned, carrying wooden tablets etched with markings from the previous day. Their task now shifted from basic assessment to categorization. Ownership, value, and destination required arrangement within a broader economic framework. The raid had gathered people and goods, but the harbor existed to transform that collection into structured outcomes. Captives were not kept indefinitely, they were processed. The intermediaries called for the captives to step forward one by one. No physical force accompanied the instruction, but the presence of armed guards made refusal implausible. The process began with the villagers, who stood stiffly before the assessors. Occupation mattered. A fisherman could serve in coastal communities. A carpenter could be placed in settlements undergoing expansion. Even a farmer held value in regions seeking to improve yields. Each individual's identity became a list of usable traits rather than a personal story. When the nuns' turn arrived, the intermediaries approached them with greater attention. Their garments identified them as members of a religious community, signaling literacy, medicinal knowledge, and organizational skill. These qualities fit categories distinct from those assigned to common villagers. They were not merely workers. They were potential assets in households that valued education, domestic management, or the influence gained through possessing a member of a clerical class. Mother Brynhild stepped forward first. Her posture conveyed composure, the same bearing she held in the convent halls. The intermediary studied her with measured curiosity. Her age did not diminish her value. Experience in leadership could be repurposed within Norse households, but the challenge lay in ransom. If captors believed she was highly valued by her community, she might be held for negotiation. If not, she would be transferred like any skilled captive. Without external communication, ransom remained uncertain. The intermediary spoke a phrase in Old Norse, slower than usual, as if attempting clarity. Though the nuns did not understand his words, the tone suggested acknowledgement of her status. A mark was cut into the wooden board beside her name. She was not dismissed harshly or relegated to a lower group. Instead, she was placed in a provisional category worth consideration, awaiting further information. Runa's assessment followed. The intermediary regarded her steadily, noting her youth, her alertness, and her composure despite fear. A brief exchange occurred between him and one of the raiders who had observed the captives during the voyage. Runa could not interpret their discussion, but she sensed the deliberation. Youth meant adaptability. Literacy meant utility. She was marked for assignment to a household rather than trade caravans. This categorization did not grant safety, but it offered a narrower range of outcomes. The younger novices were evaluated next. Elswith, still shaken, answered nothing verbally when the intermediary gestured toward her, but even silence conveyed information. Her fragility registered as both limitation and potential for low-intensity domestic placement. She would not be sent to distant markets. She required supervision, which limited her destinations. Once assessments concluded, the intermediaries reorganized the captives into new groups. These divisions reflected the first layer of ownership and administrative step that preceded actual transfer. Families, clans, or trading partners would make requests in the days to come. Captives became entries in a system that balanced need, supply, and opportunity. The nuns regrouped once the sorting ended. They examined one another with quiet concern, their expressions showing the strain of prolonged uncertainty. Mother Brynhild gathered them into a small circle near the enclosure wall. Her voice remained steady as she explained the likely outcomes based on limited historical knowledge. She emphasized that survival did not depend on resistance, but on understanding the structure surrounding them. "We must remain aware," she said. "Our actions must be deliberate. Fear cannot govern us." Runa listened closely. She recognized that information had become the most valuable resource available to them. Every detail about the Vikings' routines, hierarchy, and priorities carried potential significance. She began observing patterns: which men handled trade matters, which households appeared to have influence, which settlements received captives. The more she saw, the more she realized that their fate hinged not on divine intervention, but on their ability to navigate an unfamiliar system. Around midday, the Vikings prepared for movement. Some of the raiders departed with goods destined for nearby settlements. Others remained at the harbor to finalize sorting. A new group of Norse women arrived carrying baskets of provisions. Their presence shifted the dynamic. They discussed practical matters with the intermediaries' household needs, upcoming gatherings, and the distribution of labor. Their involvement made clear that captives would not enter a male-dominated environment alone. The domestic economy of Norse society was complex, with women holding significant authority in managing households, overseeing labor, and making decisions about the acquisition of servants. The Norse women observed the captives with a critical eye. They searched not for resistance, but for indicators of usefulness, steadiness of posture, clarity of attention, signs of skill. Their evaluation differed from the raiders, less concerned with physical capability, more focused on temperament and adaptability. As the interactions unfolded, Runa realized that she and her companions were being shaped by multiple layers of judgment, not merely taken, but measured, categorized, and prepared for integration into a system that treated captives as versatile components of daily life. The recognition brought a mixture of resignation and clarity. Understanding the system meant understanding where vulnerability lay and where opportunity might emerge. Evening returned with a muted sky and a gradual drop in temperature. Fires were lit once more along the harbor. The nuns settled into their enclosure, the sand beneath them cooling as night thickened. The voices of the Vikings drifted through the air steadily, confidently, supported by a structure that reinforced their authority. The captives had entered the first defined stage of Norse control. The raid was over. The transport had passed. Now the shaping of their new identities began, imposed by a world that sought not their destruction, but their transformation into something usable. Their future lay not in the violence of the raid, but in the quiet systems that followed, systems built not on chaos, but on certainty. The longhouse stood at the center of the settlement, its wooden frame rising above the smaller buildings around it. Smoke escaped from the opening along the roof, drifting into the gray morning sky. The structure functioned as both residence and administrative space, a place where decisions were made, goods were recorded, and the steady rhythm of community life was maintained. Captives assigned to this area learned that the longhouse represented not merely shelter, but the point from which authority extended outward. The nuns were led toward it shortly after dawn. The settlement had awakened with quiet efficiency. Men prepared for travel or work in the fields. Women arranged tools, tended livestock, and organized supplies. Children observed from doorways, studying the newcomers with curiosity rather than hostility. Their presence offered another reminder. This environment was not a battlefield. It was a functioning society with routines that carried onward regardless of the violence that had brought captives here. A woman stepped out from the longhouse to greet the intermediaries. Her name, spoken by others, resembled Sigrun. She carried herself with the assured posture of someone who understood the settlement's internal workings. Though not a chieftain, she held influence as the manager of household matters. Her attention turned toward the nuns as she assessed their condition. She issued a brief instruction, and the intermediaries stepped aside, allowing the captives to be guided forward. Inside the longhouse, the air was warm, filled with the scent of burning wood and dried herbs. Light filtered through narrow slits in the walls, illuminating storage racks, woven tapestries, and broad benches arranged along the central fire pit. Nothing appeared chaotic. Every object, from the iron tools to the piles of folded cloth, had an evident purpose. Sigrun gestured for the captives to sit on a bench near the wall. She spoke in measured tones, directing her words to the interpreters who stood nearby. Her questions, intentionally simple, concerned their skills. Who among them could read? Who knew healing herbs? Who could sew? Who had managed household stores? Who understood teaching? She did not inquire about faith or origin. Her priority was function. Mother Brynhild answered calmly through the translator, acknowledging their capabilities without embellishment. When Sigrun heard the extent of their literacy and organizational discipline, her expression shifted subtle interest, not sentiment. Their abilities fit naturally into the needs of an expansive household. They would not be relegated to field labor or harsh manual tasks. Instead, they were being integrated into a system similar in structure to their convent life, though stripped of its spiritual purpose. Runa watched Sigrun closely. The woman's authority did not stem from force, but from her central role in maintaining the longhouse. She coordinated workers, distributed tasks, and ensured that the settlement functioned without interruption. To understand survival here, one needed to understand her methods. Runa noted how Sigrun spoke, how she delegated, and how others responded. Even the raiders showed deference when entering the longhouse, waiting for acknowledgement before approaching. After the assessment, the nuns were escorted to an area at the rear of the longhouse where basic sleeping arrangements had been prepared: thin furs laid over wooden planks. Though sparse, the space was dry and warm, a marked improvement from the enclosure at the harbor. The placement was deliberate. It situated them within the heart of household activity, under constant supervision, yet also under structured expectations. Sigrun returned after a short interval, holding a selection of cloth garments. She distributed them without ceremony. These were not meant to erase the nuns' identity, but to integrate them into the settlement's daily rhythm. The garments allowed easier movement and signaled their new status as part of the household labor force. The nuns hesitated, their hands lingering on the coarse fabric, but the act of changing clothes served a practical purpose. It aligned them visually with the tasks ahead. The first responsibility assigned to them involved sorting dried herbs stored in clay jars along the wall. The longhouse maintained a substantial supply of medicinal plants used for wounds, fevers, and winter illnesses. Sigrun placed the jars before them and observed as Mother Brynhild examined the contents. The nun's familiarity with healing practices became evident quickly. She identified plants by scent and color, corrected the arrangement of several jars, and offered insight into combinations that improved their effectiveness. The translator relayed her explanations to Sigrun, who nodded with interest. The longhouse gained not just labor, but expertise. While Brynhild worked with precision, Runa assisted by organizing the storage racks. She realized that their survival depended on demonstrating competence, not defiance. Each task completed with quiet efficiency shifted their position within the household. They were no longer merely captured women. They were contributors. Elswith, still prone to trembling, received a simpler responsibility. She was asked to separate wool fibers for spinning. Sigrun observed her closely, noting her care in handling delicate materials. The task required patience more than strength, and Ellsworth's timid temperament made her suited for it. Each nun discovered that the Longhouse evaluated them through the lens of practicality. Later in the day, the captives witnessed a discussion between Sigrun and several men returning from a nearby settlement. They brought news of trade demands for the coming weeks. The discussion revealed how captives like the nuns factored into broader economic planning. Their skills aligned with domestic education, medicinal care, and record-keeping roles valuable for households seeking to elevate their standing or maintain stability. Runa began to understand the layered structure of ownership. Raiders captured, intermediaries assessed, women like Sigrun assigned duties, clan leaders approved final placements. Each step transformed captives from disconnected individuals into integrated resources. Their fate depended not on the brutality of the raid, but on the order that followed it. In the evening, the household gathered for a communal meal. The nuns were permitted to sit at a separate bench near the wall. They were neither punished nor isolated. They were simply included at a distance that reflected their status. They watched the social interactions around them, the exchanges of news, the distribution of tasks, the steady hum of communal life. As the fire dimmed and the settlement quieted, Runa lay awake, listening to the muted sounds of the Longhouse settling into night. She did not feel safe, but she felt something new: clarity. The system did not revolve around their suffering. It revolved around efficiency, hierarchy, and the incorporation of human labor into a stable structure. The violence of the raid had faded into memory, replaced by the quiet governance of daily life. Their world had shifted not through the terror of the attack, but through the calm, methodical expectations of the Longhouse that now defined their every action. The settlement began its day before sunrise. By the time the first pale light touched the edges of the Longhouse roof, activity had already formed its predictable pattern. Fires were stirred back to life, tools were arranged, and animals were fed. The rhythm was steady, shaped not by urgency but by a set of expectations that everyone in the community understood. For the captives, this routine became the framework through which their new reality unfolded. Runa woke to the sound of footsteps moving across the packed earth floor. The Longhouse held warmth from the banked embers, allowing the morning to feel less harsh than the days spent on the coast. She observed the women of the household as they began their work. They operated with quiet authority, managing tasks that sustained the entire community. Their movements offered no sign of hostility toward the captives, only a determination to maintain order. Sigrun entered with a small ledger made from thin wooden panels bound with leather cords. The object held inventories, work schedules, and records of who had been assigned to which duties. She opened it without ceremony, scanning the entries from the previous day while the translator positioned herself nearby. When Sigrun spoke, her tone remained even, without threat or emphasis. She was not issuing warnings. She was establishing structure. The nuns listened as the translator relayed the morning's assignments. Their responsibilities were neither arbitrary nor meant to instill fear. They were tasks that aligned with their previously observed abilities. Mother Brynhild would continue overseeing the herb stores. Runa would help maintain and organize written records of supplies. Ellsworth would assist with wool preparation and cloth repairs. Others from the original group were distributed throughout the Longhouse, contributing to food preparation, tool cleaning, and storage management. What struck Runa was the absence of shouted commands. Control did not require raised voices. It rested in the unbroken consistency of routine. Each instruction had its place, and each task served the settlement's larger needs. The Longhouse operated as the administrative heart of the community, and the captives were becoming part of its internal mechanisms. A group of traders arrived mid-morning, bringing requests for goods to be transported on the next outbound route. They entered the Longhouse with a formality that showed respect for Sigrun's authority. They discussed quantities of dried fish, woven cloth, and small crafted items that could be exchanged with nearby settlements. As Sigrun reviewed the list, she glanced toward Runa, indicating that the captives' work would influence how much material could be prepared before the traders' departure. Runa realized that their labor had measurable value. They were now part of the settlement's economic flow, tracked, assessed, and adjusted according to demand. Mother Brynhild examined a damaged herb jar that had fractured along one side. The cracks threatened the integrity of the stored plants. She showed it to the translator and explained how it might be repaired with resin and cloth binding. Sigrun watched closely, recognizing that the nun's knowledge exceeded basic household skill. As Brynhild applied the corrective mixture, the household women observed the process with interest, asking questions that the translator relayed. The exchange was not marked by hostility. It was professional, almost instructional. In this environment, knowledge itself held influence. Brynhild's experience with healing made her valuable. Runa's literacy positioned her closer to administrative tasks than manual labor. Even Elswith's gentle demeanor suited the delicate work of textile preparation. Their new roles were not acts of mercy. They were strategic placements within an organized system. Later, Sigrun conducted an inspection of the longhouse storage. She moved through the shelves with practiced attention, checking measurements and consistency. The nuns followed alongside her and the translator, learning how supplies were categorized. Everything from grain to iron tools had designated sections. The longhouse did not rely on guesswork. It relied on order. The inspection revealed the deeper structure of control. Captives did not require chains when routines, responsibilities, and supervision shaped their movements. Their participation in the longhouse made escape difficult, not because guards blocked the exits, but because the settlement's internal organization absorbed them into its functioning. One of the raiders entered with a question about repairs to a damaged shield rim. He held the object with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to battle. Yet his demeanor softened as he approached Sigrun. She answered him with directness, assigning the repair task to another household member and marking the order into her ledger. Runa observed how even the warriors deferred to her. Authority here did not rest solely in physical strength. It rested in coordination, resource management, and knowledge of the community's needs. That afternoon, the nuns assisted in organizing the brewing supplies stored near the rear of the longhouse. The process required careful handling of containers filled with fermented mixtures used for both consumption and preservation. The work demonstrated another layer of community structure, one built on shared labor rather than a single dominant figure. As the day progressed, Runa noted subtle details of the settlement's social hierarchy. Chieftains and warriors held external power. Women like Sigrun managed the internal structure. Elderly members offered guidance. Captives were integrated into tasks that supported all these roles. The community functioned as a network rather than a chain, with each person contributing to the stability that allowed raids and travel to occur without disrupting life at home. At dusk, the longhouse filled with the low hum of conversation as the household gathered for the evening meal. The nuns were again placed near the wall, close enough to observe the community, but separate enough to reflect their status. No one threatened them. No one spoke cruelly. Their presence had shifted from novelty to routine. Runa listened to the conversations, discussions of weather patterns, trade opportunities, and preparations for winter. There was no mention of the raid or the suffering of the previous weeks. The settlement had already absorbed the event into its ongoing cycle. Stability had resumed, and the captives were now part of that continuity. When the fire dimmed and the longhouse settled into rest, Runa lay awake once more, recognizing a truth that had become increasingly clear. Control here operated through structure, not spectacle. The violence of the raid had been only an entry point. The true force that held them in place was the quiet, persistent order of the longhouse, a system that moved forward regardless of who entered it. The settlement gave the appearance of stability, but beneath its predictable rhythm lay a set of pressures that shaped every decision, every task, and every conversation. These were not spoken openly. They surfaced in the pauses between instructions, in the careful tracking of supplies, and in the wary glances exchanged when unexpected visitors arrived. The nuns began to notice these small tensions as they adjusted to the settlement's structured routine. Runa learned this first through the ledger work. Each morning, Sigrun handed her a thin wooden tablet containing inventories recorded the previous day. At first glance, the entries seemed orderly and complete. But as Runa copied the details into a more permanent record, she saw patterns that hinted at strain. The grain supply was lower than expected for the time of year. Iron tools required repairs faster than they could be replaced. Cloth reserves shifted unpredictably based on trade demands. These were not signs of collapse, but they revealed a settlement working at the edge of its balance. Sigrun noticed Runa's careful attention and observed her writing for a moment before offering a small nod. The gesture carried no warmth, yet there was an acknowledgement of competence. It also revealed that Sigrun understood the implications of the numbers and that she needed them assessed accurately. Later that morning, a group of men returned from a short expedition. Their arrival disrupted the household rhythm. They brought news of increasing competition along the coast. Other raiding bands, driven by scarcity or ambition, had begun venturing into lands previously ignored. This meant disputes over territory, trade routes, and resources. The message was delivered quietly, but it left a subtle tension in the air. The nuns were not told the details, but they sensed the shift. Voices lowered. Tasks grew more deliberate. Even the longhouse felt heavier, as if the walls themselves understood the stakes. Mother Brynhild, working near the herb storage, watched these changes with steady concern. She noticed how several families stored small bundles of food outside the usual inventories. These hidden reserves were tucked in corners beneath furs and clay jars. They were not acts of defiance. They were signs of preparation, small safeguards, held privately in a community that could not afford open anxiety. Elswith, assisting with textile repairs, overheard conversations that revealed another pressure: the winter ahead. Weather had been unpredictable, and the settlement relied heavily on seasonal harvests. If the conditions worsened, everything from livestock feed to firewood demands would strain the community further. Her quiet work aligning woven edges gave her the opportunity to listen without appearing to watch. Even the children displayed traces of these concerns. Their play, once loud and unrestrained, became more contained around the longhouse. They mimicked adults by constructing small enclosures and assigning one another roles of record keeper, guard, or messenger. Their games mirrored the tasks they saw, a reflection of a community shaped not only by labor, but by the anticipation of need. In the afternoon, a council meeting took place at the center of the settlement. Representatives from nearby communities had arrived, carrying concerns of their own. The nuns observed from a distance as voices layered over one another in low, measured tones. The discussion was not hostile, but it carried urgency. Runa noted that several men carried ledgers similar to Sigrun's, filled with numbers that dictated decisions more than opinions did. Supply projections, trade stability, raiding risks, winter contingencies. These matters framed the settlement's true vulnerabilities. As the discussion continued, the translator returned briefly to check on the captives. Runa asked a single question: why had the atmosphere changed? The translator hesitated before answering. Competition for resources was rising. Trade relations were under strain, and the settlements along the coast had begun encountering difficulties securing livestock and metal shipment. These factors made every household's efficiency, every captive's contribution, more significant. It became clear that the nuns' work was not simply supportive. It was part of a larger system attempting to maintain equilibrium. When the meeting adjourned, the community resumed its routine, but the underlying pressure remained. Sigrun returned to the longhouse, moving with the controlled pace of someone who understood both the limits of their resources and the consequences of mismanaging them. She reviewed the ledgers again, marking faded entries and underlining shortages that required attention. In the evening, Runa delivered the updated records to her. Sigrun studied them quietly, tracing her finger along the page as if confirming calculations she had already made in her mind. She gave a single instruction to the translator: efforts must increase. Cloth production, herb preparation, and tool repair schedules would be adjusted. Not drastically, but enough to strengthen the community's reserves. No threats were issued. No voices rose. Control remained calm, deliberate, and precise. That night during the evening meal, the longhouse held an unusual quiet. Conversations that typically flowed easily were replaced by thoughtful chewing and occasional glances toward the central fire. The nuns sensed that something larger pressed upon the settlement, something that stretched beyond their capture and beyond the immediate concerns of daily labor. Runa lay awake beneath her sleeping mat, listening to the settling timbers of the longhouse roof. She understood now that their presence was tied to forces far larger than an isolated raid. They were additional hands in a system striving to maintain stability against shifting conditions. Their labor-filled spaces left by shortages eased burdens created by competition and supported a structure tightening under unseen weight. The settlement was not collapsing, but it was being tested, and the nuns, willingly or not, were becoming part of how it kept itself intact. The settlement functioned through a structure that appeared simple on the surface, yet each part depended on an intricate web of responsibilities. No one explained this system outright. Instead, the nuns learned it by observing the movement of tasks through the day, the exchanges between households, and the way decisions passed from one person to another without formal announcements. Order existed through routine, habit, and expectation rather than written instruction. Every morning began with the same sequence. The fires were rekindled, water was drawn, and animals were checked for injuries or illness. Even within these basic motions, roles were clearly defined. Older women oversaw the preparation of food. Men inspected tools or prepared for the day's travel. Younger boys fetched firewood. Girls sorted cloth or herbs. No one questioned these divisions. They were shaped by years of practice and reinforced through quiet repetition. The nuns were placed into this structure, not through ceremony, but through necessity. Mother Brynhild was sent to assist with tasks that required steadiness rather than speed. She washed herbs, sorted dried roots, and helped maintain the storage loft. Her work revealed another aspect of the settlement's order, a constant awareness of supplies. Nothing was wasted. Even broken baskets were rewoven into smaller ones, and torn fabric was turned into binding strips. Brynhild noticed that every resource passed through multiple uses before it was discarded. She had rarely seen such careful management in her monastery, where reliance on local tithes softened the need for strict conservation. Elswith, whose hands were skilled with thread, merged quickly into textile work. She joined a circle of women repairing garments and reweaving damaged cloaks. The atmosphere was quiet. The women spoke in short exchanges, mostly about upcoming travel routes or expected weather changes. They did not gossip or linger over stories. Their work maintained the settlement's protection against the approaching cold, and this responsibility left little room for distraction. Elswith felt herself absorbed into a rhythm that allowed little emotional expression, but offered a form of stability. Runa continued her work with the records, which gave her the clearest view of the settlement's internal structure. Every activity, hunting, weaving, toolmaking, storage, livestock care, connected to a set of numbers. The settlement did not operate on casual judgment. Its order depended on tracking what was gained, what was used, and what would be needed weeks ahead. Runa realized that the reason tasks shifted without argument was because each person understood their place in a system shaped by measured demands rather than personal preference. One afternoon, she observed a discussion between Sigrun and a man responsible for livestock. It was brief, but revealing. He presented her with carved tablets showing the feed available for the next month. Sigrun compared the numbers to earlier records and determined that grazing routes needed to be adjusted. She did not command. She simply stated the conclusion, and the man nodded and left to implement it. This exchange demonstrated how authority worked here, through proficiency rather than fear. Those who understood the system directed those who carried it out. Despite these structured roles, there was also a flexible layer beneath the surface. When a household faced a sudden task repairing a roof, tending to an injured goat, preparing for visitors, neighbors arrived without being asked. Their assistance was not considered generosity. It was a form of mutual reinforcement within a system that valued stability. The settlement could not afford isolated households. If one faltered, the strain shifted to all others. The nuns saw this principle clearly when a small fire damaged a storage shed. It occurred during the midday meal, and within moments, individuals from across the settlement ran to contain it. Buckets passed hand to hand. Tools appeared with no instruction. When the fire was extinguished, the community reorganized themselves into repair teams, dividing the tasks silently. No one supervised. The system operated as if every person knew exactly where to place their effort. As the nuns helped sweep debris, they realized that such cooperation was not an act of unity, but an obligation. Order required maintenance. A disruption anywhere tested the settlement everywhere. The calm structure depended on collective vigilance. The tranquility of this system, however, masked a deeper tension. Runa observed that Sigrun updated the records twice as often now. Elswith noticed that the textile circle worked later into the evenings. Mother Brynhild saw herbs being rationed more carefully. These small adjustments revealed increasing pressure. The order held, but it required more effort to maintain. In the evenings, when the longhouse grew quiet, the nuns reflected on their former life. In the monastery, order came from scripture, ritual, and devotion. Here, order came from survival. It had no sacred center, no divine mandate. It was maintained because without it, the settlement would falter. This realization created a distance between the nuns and their memories of home. Their new environment operated on principles that felt foreign yet unavoidable. As days passed, the nuns grew accustomed to these patterns. They moved within the system not as outsiders but as participants guided by necessity. Yet they also recognized that this order, however stable, remained vulnerable. It depended on resources arriving on time, weather cooperating, and other settlements respecting territorial boundaries. A single disruption could strain the balance. The nuns understood now that their presence was not incidental. They were additional hands reinforcing a structure under pressure. Their labor became part of a broader system of endurance, shaped not by belief, but by the settlement's quiet, disciplined need to keep itself intact. The settlement's rhythm tightened as the colder winds signaled the nearing of winter. Every task gained new urgency, even if no one openly acknowledged it. The nuns noticed the shift first in the pacing of the mornings. People rose earlier, fires were lit sooner, and tools were arranged before the sun fully crested the horizon. The calm order remained, but it now carried a weight that suggested careful calculation. Runa saw the change most clearly in the records. Sigrun handed her new tablets each morning filled with updates from hunting groups, textile circles, and storage counts. These numbers had grown more precise. Instead of broad inventories, the tablets now contained detailed measurements, down to the smallest increments of grain or root. Runa understood that the settlement tracked not simply what it possessed, but what it believed it could survive on through the coldest months. Sigrun's expression remained composed, but her voice grew more concise when giving instructions. The ledger work expanded, requiring Runa to compare past winter's patterns to current supplies. She noticed inconsistencies. The grain harvest was smaller than the previous year. The smoked fish inventory had not met its expected count, and the number of usable animal hides was lower. None of these shortages were severe alone, but collectively they revealed a season that would demand restraint. Elswith witnessed similar concerns in her tasks. The textile circle no longer focused on decorative stitching or repairs alone. Their work shifted almost entirely to producing heavier garments, lined cloaks, reinforced tunics, and additional bedding layers. The women worked without complaint, but the tension showed in the way they rechecked fabric widths and counted thread bundles twice before beginning each piece. Their movements were careful, deliberate, and aware of the stakes. Mother Brynhild, assigned to herb sorting, saw that the medicinal supplies were being rationed more carefully. Herbs previously stored in open baskets were now divided into smaller packets and marked with restricted use. Brynhild asked the translator why this was necessary, and the answer was simple. Illness increased during the winter, and the settlement could not risk shortages. Even simple remedies needed to be preserved with discipline. The livestock pens also reflected the growing strain. Animals were brought inside more frequently, reducing their exposure to the cold. Children were tasked with collecting additional bedding materials to keep them warm. Men spent hours reinforcing enclosures, ensuring that no structural faults would risk losing vital stock. The nuns helped where they could, but the shift in atmosphere required little explanation. Winter demanded more from every hand. One afternoon, the settlement gathered around the central fire for a planning discussion. The nuns observed from the edge, listening as households reviewed their contributions and needs. Topics ranged from hunting schedules to the redistribution of wood supplies. There was no argument, only the steady exchange of facts. Yet the underlying concern was unmistakable. Every person understood the margin for error had narrowed. During the meeting, a messenger returned from a neighboring settlement. His arrival caused quiet conversation to ripple through the assembly. He delivered news that their neighbors had already begun rationing more heavily than expected. A shortage of dried meat, caused by poor preservation conditions, had left them vulnerable. This information heightened the settlement's awareness of its own precarious balance. The messenger stayed only long enough to share details before leaving, his urgency emphasizing the seriousness of the situation. That evening, the settlement's work extended well past sunset. Fires were stoked brighter, allowing tasks to continue. Runa assisted in compiling a revised stock assessment. Elswith helped finalize cloaks needed before the first snow. Brynhild prepared lists of herbs to be used sparingly over the coming months. Their integration into this process was no longer temporary. They were part of the community's preparations, however involuntarily. As the nuns lay down to rest, the longhouse echoed with the softened sounds of a community settling into uneasy sleep. The fire's glow flickered across the ceiling, casting shifting patterns that hinted at the uncertainty ahead. Outside, the wind carried a sharper edge, brushing against the wooden planks with a reminder of the approaching cold. Runa felt the strain more acutely that night. The numbers she had copied showed a clear path forward, but also the narrowness of that path. Elswith sensed it in the tired movements of the women beside her. Brynhild recognized it in the muted urgency with which herbs were rationed. The settlement's structure remained strong, but winter exposed its vulnerabilities. The nuns understood that the coming season would test the community's system of order more than any raid or external threat. Winter was impartial, demanding resilience from all. Their labor, once a matter of adaptation, became necessary for the settlement's survival. The preparations continued, steady and disciplined, guided not by fear, but by a pragmatic awareness of what must be done. And though the community did not express its anxieties in words, the nuns felt them in every task. The strain was subtle but unmistakable, a tension woven into the final weeks before winter's arrival. The first snow did not fall with ceremony. It arrived quietly in the early hours before dawn, settling over the settlement in a thin, pale layer that softened the sounds of morning. When the doors of the longhouse opened, the nuns stepped into a world altered by silence. The air felt still, carrying a warning more than a greeting. Winter had begun. The settlement reacted immediately. Tasks that were once measured by preference now followed a strict sequence shaped by necessity. The men inspected the roofs, brushing away snow that might accumulate into dangerous weight. Children collected whatever dry wood remained near the longhouse walls. Women secured storage lids and checked that no stray drafts penetrated the food cellars. The snow was light, but it signaled the start of a long season that allowed little space for error. Runa walked to the storage house with Sigrun, carrying the day's record tablets. The path was firm beneath the snow, and the cold air stung her fingers, even within her woven gloves. Inside the storage building, the atmosphere changed sharply from the chill outside to a dense, dry stillness. Sigrun performed her routine inspection, opening clay jars and brushing her hands over grain piles to check their condition. Runa understood that this assessment would determine the settlement's daily allotments for weeks. As Sigrun examined the supplies, Runa noticed new markings on the ledger tablet's notations made in smaller script, referencing weather patterns and projected consumption rates. These markings formed a map of the settlement's strategy. Grain would be measured more tightly. Smoked meat would be opened only on specific days. Herb reserves would remain untouched unless illness required them. Runa copied the details without needing explanation. The numbers themselves expressed the community's priorities. Elswith spent the morning indoors with the textile circle. Sewing continued, but now their focus had shifted from preparing garments to maintaining them. Cloaks were inspected for wear, frayed edges reinforced, and linings tested against drafts. The women worked without pause, their hands accustomed to the cold that seeped through the longhouse walls. Ellsworth saw that even a small tear left unattended could compromise a garment's warmth. Every stitch mattered. Mother Brynhild joined the older women in tending the hearths. The fires required constant attention now that the temperatures had dropped. She learned to read the fire's behavior, the subtle hiss when damp wood burned, the faint crackle of resin, the importance of feeding the flames steadily rather than in bursts. The longhouse relied on these fires for warmth and cooking, and a lapse in tending them could disrupt the household's routine. By midday, snow fell again, this time thicker. The world beyond the longhouse blurred into slow-moving white. The settlement functioned inside this muted landscape, adjusting its activities to the limitations imposed by weather. Livestock were brought into sheltered pens. Water was heated to prevent freezing. Tools were cleaned and stored, so no metal rusted or warped in the cold. The nuns observed how winter reordered the settlement's priorities. Tasks that had once been carried out with a sense of rhythm and continuity were now tightly bound to survival. Even small moments, scraping ice from steps, securing roof edges, checking for air leaks became part of the daily routine. In the afternoon, a hunting party returned, moving with deliberate steps through the accumulating snow. Their return was met with quiet acknowledgement, but it was clear the trip had been difficult. The hunters carried less game than hoped. Their faces were drawn, and their clothes stiff with frozen moisture. The settlement accepted the small yield without complaint. It was an expected challenge of early winter. The nuns understood that the shortages revealed in the ledgers were not simply theoretical. They were becoming real. Later, when the sky dimmed earlier than usual, a quiet settled over the settlement. The wind brushed along the wooden walls, creating a soft, rhythmic pulse. Inside the longhouse, the fire cast a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold outside. The nuns ate their meal silently, aware of the burdens the winter placed on everyone. Each movement felt more contained, shaped by an underlying need to conserve energy. As night fell, Runa reviewed the day's entries once more. The snow had signaled more than a change in weather. It marked a shift in the settlement's entire operation. Everything tightened, from tasks to tone to expectations. The nuns were no longer adjusting to their new environment. They were becoming part of its measured response to winter's demands. Mother Brynhild lay awake that night, listening to the wind as it passed through the gaps in the wooden planks. She recognized the sound not as a threat, but as a reminder of the environment shaping their days. Ellsworth watched the flames flicker in the hearth and considered how much the settlement relied on small acts of maintenance, mending, tending, and recording. Runa closed her eyes. The numbers of the ledger still etched in her mind. Each task fed into another, forming a chain that held the community together. The snow continued through the night. In the morning, the settlement would rise to face its deepening winter. The nuns understood that the season ahead would test not only their endurance, but also the quiet system of order that governed the community. Winter revealed how fragile even well-organized structures could be, and how much depended on every individual within them. The first sign of illness appeared in the quiet hours before dawn. A child's cough, sharp and persistent, echoed through the longhouse in a way that unsettled the routine calm. Winter often brought sickness, but the early arrival of symptoms created an unease that carried beyond the child's family. By morning, the settlement understood that this was not an isolated case. 2 adults complained of aches and weakness, and a young woman struggled to rise from her sleeping mat. Illness had entered the longhouse. Mother Brynhild recognized the pattern immediately. The symptoms mirrored those she had treated in her monastery during harsh winters: cough, fatigue, chills, and difficulty breathing in cold air. These were manageable with the right herbs and techniques, but dangerous if resources were limited. Brynhild approached the herb storage with measured steps, aware that each remedy carried value in a season of scarcity. The older women assigned to assist her opened baskets carefully, mindful of how much remained. Winter illness required caution. Runa adjusted her tasks for the day. Sigrun handed her the ledgers as usual, but her expression carried a subtle change. Illness meant increased strain on supplies, more firewood for warmth, more herbs for treatment, and fewer hands available for labor. The numbers reflected this shift. Runa recorded firewood expenditures and compared grain use against projected recoveries. She saw how quickly small imbalances could escalate. Her work became not just a record of the present, but a forecast of potential risk. Elswith joined a group preparing warm garments for those affected. The textile work shifted from production to maintenance. Cloaks were mended, additional layers sewn into tunics, and strips of cloth wrapped into tight bundles to be used as warm compresses. The atmosphere carried no panic, but it held urgency. Illness during winter required a different pace, one that moved quickly but quietly. Throughout the morning, settlement members gathered near the central fire to discuss the signs. There was no dramatic announcement, only a collective understanding that certain tasks needed rearranging. Those showing symptoms were moved closer to the hearth. Food preparation shifted to accommodate softer, warmer meals. Men reduced their outdoor work, conserving strength in case the illness spread. Children were instructed to remain within the longhouse to avoid cold exposure. Mother Brynhild administered herbs with practiced calm. She boiled mixtures of dried mint, willow bark, and elderflower, allowing the steam to rise before giving the warm liquid to the sick. She instructed families to keep the patients near heat and ensure they drank small amounts regularly. Her presence created stability, not through authority, but through familiarity with these seasonal hardships. By midday, Sigrun visited the sick herself. She spoke briefly with Brynhild through the translator, asking how the illness progressed and what supplies were required. Brynhild responded with careful restraint, requesting only what she believed essential. The settlement could not afford excessive use of herbs. Sigrun accepted her list and instructed others to assist Brynhild with boiling water and tending the hearths. The illness continued to spread modestly over the next day, not rapidly, but enough to create concern. A young hunter developed a fever, limiting his ability to participate in winter activities. An elderly woman remained weak despite warm compresses. The longhouse atmosphere grew heavier. People moved more slowly, guarding their energy, listening for changes in breathing or signs of worsening symptoms. Runa updated the records each evening. She noted the reduction in available labor, the increased consumption of broth and herbs, and the shift in firewood usage. Her calculations showed how illness affected not only individuals, but the entire system. When one person could not work, others absorbed their tasks, stretching the community's balance. Runa understood now why the settlement treated resources with such precision. Winter illness did not simply disrupt, it multiplied strain. Elswith saw how the illness altered the rhythm of textile work. The women worked more quietly, aware that any breath of cold air could aggravate symptoms. Those who remained healthy adjusted their roles to compensate for absent hands. Sewing circles became smaller. Stitches grew more deliberate. Cloth was used sparingly. The routines continued, but the tone shifted from preparation to preservation. At night, the longhouse grew warmer from the constant tending of fires. The sickness required heat, and so the hearths burned steadily, the air filled with the faint scent of herbs. The nuns lay awake listening to the soft coughs that broke the silence. They understood that illness in a monastery posed challenges, but illness within a winter settlement carried deeper risks. There were no nearby communities to offer aid, no surplus of supplies to draw from, no margin for complacency. Mother Brynhild continued her work without rest. She monitored fevers, adjusted remedies, and observed signs of improvement. She also recognized limits. These were not patients of a monastery, but members of a settlement whose bodies bore the strain of constant labor and harsh weather. Illness affected them differently, requiring careful attention to balance exhaustion with recovery. Days passed, and a pattern emerged. Some individuals improved, their coughs softening and their strength returning. Others remained weakened but stable. The illness did not sweep through the settlement with severity, but it lingered enough to remind everyone of winter's unpredictable nature. The nuns saw that the community did not respond to illness with fear or avoidance. They responded with structure. Tasks shifted without complaint. Supplies were rationed with foresight. People moved in ways that protected others from unnecessary strain. Illness became another part of the winter routine, absorbed into the settlement's system of order. By the end of the week, the longhouse regained some of its earlier rhythm, though quieter and more measured. The first snow had introduced challenges, and illness had pressed the settlement further. The nuns understood now that winter's test was not a single hardship, but a series of demands that reinforced each other. And despite the strain, the settlement continued, its structure holding through cautious adjustment and collective endurance. Winter ended not with a dramatic thaw, but with a slow, steady loosening of the cold that had shaped every day of the season. The snow remained on the ground, but its edges softened. Ice along the path to the storage houses thinned. The wind carried a muted tone, less sharp, less urgent. These changes did not transform the settlement overnight, but they signaled the beginning of something the community had waited for with quiet discipline. The nuns noticed the shift first in the mornings. When the longhouse doors opened, the air still carried winter's chill, yet it no longer felt impenetrable. Smoke rose more gently into the sky. The sun lingered slightly longer along the horizon. The settlement moved with the same structured rhythm, but there was a lightness beneath the routine, not joy, but relief. Daily tasks continued, as winter had not yet released its hold. Firewood was still rationed, herbs remained tightly managed, and food supplies were measured with the same precision. Yet the community's actions no longer carried the underlying strain of survival. Instead, they carried the momentum of continuity. The settlement had endured the hardest part of the season, and this endurance shaped every gesture. Runa sensed the change through the ledgers. Sigrun still updated them with care, but the notations shifted from constraint to gradual recalibration. Grain levels stabilized as consumption eased. Dried fish stores remained sufficient. Herb usage declined as illness receded. Runa recorded these details with steady hands, aware that the numbers now reflected not scarcity, but resilience. Elswith saw similar signs in the textile circle. Repairs remained necessary, but the urgent pace softened. The women spoke more freely, their voices no longer weighed by uncertainty. They discussed repairs needed in the coming weeks, preparations for warmer weather, and tasks postponed during the winter months. The cloth they handled seemed lighter, not in weight, but in meaning. Winter garments had served their purpose. Soon, lighter work would take their place. Mother Brynhild noticed the improvement in health across the longhouse. Fevers had subsided, coughs faded into occasional echoes. She adjusted the herb storage accordingly, separating winter remedies from those used in transitional seasons. The older women assisting her moved with renewed steadiness. Their expressions remained reserved, but their bodies carried less fatigue. The settlement, while unchanged in structure, now held room for deeper breaths. Children stepped outside for short moments, their boots pressing into softened snow. Men repaired hunting tools in anticipation of spring roots. Women aired garments in brief intervals of sunlight. These were not celebrations, but acknowledgments, small markers of the end of a season that had tested every household. One morning, a messenger from the coastal settlement arrived. This time his news carried neither warning nor strain. The coastal community had stabilized its trade. Fishing boats prepared for early routes, and winter disruptions appeared to be resolving. The messenger's presence alone signaled improvement. Travel in winter had been risky, yet now the path was passable. When he spoke with Sigrun, the tone between them was measured but steady. They reviewed supply exchanges, discussed upcoming trade routes, and reaffirmed expectations for cooperation. The message was simple. The region had endured. This shaped the settlement's next steps more than any ledger entry or storage count. That evening, the longhouse gathered around a fire that felt warmer than in previous months. The flames reflected not excess, but a controlled comfort earned through discipline. People spoke in low tones, not out of worry, but because winter had trained them to conserve energy, even now. Yet beneath their quiet voices was the unmistakable presence of relief. The settlement had crossed a threshold. The nuns felt this shift within themselves. Runa no longer copied numbers shaped solely by scarcity, but by planning for recovery. Elswith's stitches prepared garments for seasons beyond winter. Brynhild's herbs transitioned from emergency remedies to ordinary maintenance. Their tasks remained essential, but they no longer carried the same weight of survival. As days passed, sunlight stretched further. Drips of melting ice echoed along the roofs. The settlement prepared for travel and repair work once early spring fully emerged. The nuns observed the renewed pace not as outsiders, but as participants shaped by the season. They had learned the settlement's rhythm not through instruction, but through endurance. Their place in the community had changed. Though nothing was spoken, people approached them with familiarity. Tasks were handed to them with trust. Even the children paused to watch them work, no longer wary but curious. The bond was not friendship, nor was it acceptance in the way the nuns once understood it. It was integration through shared hardship. On a morning when the frost was thin enough to crack underfoot, Sigrun approached Runa with a new set of tablets. These contained projections not for winter, but for the season ahead. Hunting routes, cloth production schedules, and herb gathering plans. The shift was subtle, but it signaled renewal. Runa copied the information, aware that this new order reflected the settlement's transition from survival to rebuilding. The longhouse felt lighter that night. The air no longer pressed against the walls. The fire burned steadily, not fiercely. The nuns lay awake, listening not to winter's warnings, but to the softened sounds of a community moving forward. The settlement had weathered illness, scarcity, and uncertainty. Its order had held through discipline rather than force. As dawn broke the next day, light returned earlier than before. It stretched across the snow, revealing the settlement with clarity, wooden walls worn by cold, roofs lined with thawing frost, and paths shaped by months of careful movement. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The settlement did not celebrate the end of winter. It simply accepted it, adapting as it always had. And within this quiet transition, the nuns understood the deepest truth of their experience. Survival here was not shaped by dramatic events or singular acts of strength, but by a continuous, disciplined commitment to the tasks that sustained life. The winter had tested the settlement, and it had endured. Now, as the light returned, the community prepared for the next season with the same measured steadiness that had carried it through the cold. The nuns, shaped by this resilience, understood that they too had become part of this quiet order.